Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Sochi today. Ahead of their discussions, Pompeo met with his Russian counterpart, Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov. They discussed a number of disagreements between the two countries, Iran, Venezuela, and election interference. But the Secretary of State expressed optimism. Here's what he said in a press conference after the meeting.
We had a frank discussion about many issues, including many places where we disagree. The United States stands ready to find common ground with Russia as long as the two of us can engage seriously on those issues.
Thomas Wright is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution Project on international order and strategy. Thomas, you saw the secretary's openness. He was talking about discussing, but there are some really significant political differences, Venezuela among them. Why is it that Russia chooses to continue to support President Maduro?
Well, I think that the big picture on today is that Secretary of State Pompeo went to Russia to really deliver on what President Trump wants, which is now that the Mueller report is out. Trump has been very clear that he wants to try to work more closely with Russia. So I think that's the reason for Pompeo's trip. And that's what he was saying in the overall framing of the meeting. But on the substance, on the issues, the gap is as wide as ever. And of course, Venezuela is one of those issues where Putin and Russia has a very different view and is backing Maduro. I thought, well, there was no real movement on that today. I think Russia sees it as an opportunity to try to draw an equivalence between the Western Hemisphere for the US and for Eastern Europe for Russia. So I'd like to sort of make the point that if the US feels Russia shouldn't be interfering, that the same should apply to them in Eastern Europe. I think also they don't like this idea of sort of color revolutions or of dislodging autocrats from power. And they sort of see Maduro as an ally. So that's sort of the reason. But I thought what was interesting about the press conference between Lavrov and Pompeo is that Lavrov is sort of poking the US side and trying to show that there was a little bit of daylight or differences of view really between John Bolton and between the president on whether or not the US should intervene.
And part of that poking, you know, on the issue of Iran and sanctions, Lavrov called the American sanctions illegitimate. You know, is there really going to be any sort of agreement to get both the U.S. and Russia on the same page with Iran? I mean, this has been quite some time that the two have had such distance.
I think there's always been some significant difference ever since President Trump took over, because Russia has supported the JCPOA, but more generally, Russia, of course, is an effective sort of friend or ally of Iran in the region. Now, they do sort of play both sides a little bit, but I think they don't want to see sort of increased pressure, U.S. pressure on Iran. And I think they were using sort of the current escalation in tensions to make that opposition quite clear, to try to garner maybe public support for their position.
You know, Lavrov at one point pulled out some sort of an article looking at election interference decades ago, saying that this was, again, they were talking in the newspaper back in the day about Russian interference. How likely is it that Russia will adhere to the details, in the laid out in the Mueller report? Do you see them backing off in any future election?
I think it's highly likely they interfere again, because I think what the president has basically said is that there will be no cost. In fact, he would pretty much welcome it. He didn't mention it in his phone call with Putin. Pompeo, being sort of a smart operator, knew that he needed to say today, and he did say to the Russian side, they shouldn't interfere again. But the administration has been really quiet on what consequences it envisages on Russia if it was to repeat what it did in 2016. So I think it's a real risk, particularly because they may believe that they've gotten away with it before.
Yesterday it was announced President Trump and President Putin will meet face-to-face in the upcoming G20 summit in Japan. What do you expect from that meeting?
Well, I think what President Trump will expect is he hopes he will be able to turn the page in the last 2 years and have a closer relationship with Putin. He's said on a number of occasions that he believes he was unable to do that because of the Russia interference story. So he thinks that he was sort of compelled to have a tougher line because of the broader narrative. So the big question will be, what does that mean? Does he actually move closer to Putin's position? But I think the big problem that Trump has actually on reaching out to Russia is that he has really no idea what he wants from Russia. Like, what are the tangible concessions he wants, and what are the things that he would trade in exchange for that? I think he just generally wants a good relationship without knowing how to operationalize it, and I think that will become more evident as the meeting with Putin approaches.
Thomas Wright. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.